Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you are listening to the Sounds of Film. And I'm very excited to have on the program today author Dick Russell. He is the author of an incredible new book called The Real RFK Jr. Trials of a Truth Warrior. Um, Dick is an investigative journalist and an author of 15 books, including three New York Times bestsellers. Really excited to have Dick on the program and to talk about Robert Kennedy Jr. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Thanks, Tom. Really good to be with you.
Yeah, so it's funny with the debate that just happened with Biden and Trump. I would have guessed that the Democratic Party was going to be reaching out to Robert Kennedy Jr. to see if he might want to come back to the party, but that does not seem to be happening. They really don't seem interested in that. Your book, I think, if readers get a chance to read it, might understand why. But in any case, this is a fascinating book that really gets into the man and his career and where he's at now and what he wants to do moving forward. Just before we really get into some of the stuff in the book, what do you make of this current debate and Robert Kennedy Jr.'s current run for the presidency?
Yeah, well, he didn't want to leave the Democratic Party, and he wanted to, he's lifelong Democrat. His family, of course, all staunch Democrats, but they just aced him out. I mean, they put him on the sidelines. They weren't about to entertain his candidacy, and I mean, I remember I've known him for many years, so I did not write this biography as a campaign biography. I'd started it before he ever decided to run for president, but um, we did talk about it when he was about to announce, and he said, he just didn't see anybody else out there that could heal the terrible divide in this country. And he's been working across party lines for years. He knows how to talk to all kinds of people, and he sincerely, I mean, I think they don't want him in there because he's dangerous, to the status quo, and he doesn't. As he said, the Democratic Party is not what it used to be. He feels like it's become very corrupted, and he's not a fan of the Republicans either. So I think he's now polling his numbers since the last debate. With he you could ask me about it. He did he called it the realdebate.com. So in Los Angeles, he had a big audience there to where they would pause Trump and Biden, and then they would put him on answering the same questions. And 11 million people have listened to that. So
Wow.
even though they excluded him, he went ahead and did this kind of creative thing.
Why do you think they so so strongly not want him to be part of the Democratic Party in terms of running for office? I mean, it's striking. I could see that there's differences, but they don't seem willing to budge on that at all and haven't been for a while.
No, and I think that there's a perception of him. He's considered an anti-vaxxer, a conspiracy theorist, and really going against the grain of mainstream politics. And I mean, he's not an anti-vaxxer. I mean, he's come out a number of times and said this, but he's been fighting the public health war, I guess you'd say, for a long time because. For one thing, he's always called for vaccines to be tested against a placebo, and also he says if he gets elected president, he's going to eliminate this liability, the no liability for the big vaccine manufacturers, things like that, and take the pharma ads off TV because the way he sees it, we've been the Democratic Party and the Republicans too have been corrupted by the pharmaceutical industry, which is the biggest lobbying force in Washington D.C. And so he would change those things, and that's what scares them. And they just would soon he'd go away. That's for sure.
Well, one of the things that I love in this book, and there's a lot of things, is that you really give us a good portrait of the man. And besides some of the stuff that maybe people know already about him, I honestly did not know to the degree that you go into it in the book all of his interests and things that he's done throughout his life as a young man. from the travel that he did to his hobbies to his talents. There's so many different things that you explore in the book, but can you give me a little bit what really popped out for you in terms of what really distinguishes him in terms of his interests as a young person, and from his stuff like outside of the environmental and political stuff that people may know about?
Yeah, well, of course, along those lines, as a boy, he wanted to be a veterinarian. I mean, he fell in love with animals, was given opportunities. They lived in a very rural area in Hickory Hill, Virginia, and so he was raising falcons from the time he was just a kid, and so that was always a passion of his. And then what I really did not know until we got into the book was he organized for years these whitewater rafting expeditions in Latin America, where he traveled widely as a young man, and man, they were harrowing. I mean, they took on some of the most powerful waterways with waterfalls and souse holes in existence, and he came close to not surviving that a couple of times. So he's got a lot of guts. I mean, a lot of courage, and would but he also was a very communal person in a sense. I mean, he'd bring all of his friends on these trips, and they would look forward to them. And they did it year after year. So that was one thing that stood out. And another thing that I don't know how many people know this, but he's not ashamed to talk about it or afraid. And that's the fact that after his father's assassination, I mean, he was a mess, and you can imagine. And he became a heroin addict for 14 years until he almost OD'd on an airplane going to South Dakota. And he went into rehab, and then he went into AA, which he's still in to this day. And he was, when we'd sit down to talk for the biography, he was not ever afraid to bring that up, and because and the way I came away feeling is that with the fentanyl crisis, for example, in our country now, so many, thousands of parents are suffering, their kids are suffering, going through this, many of them are dying, that he'd be somebody who's been there, he's been to the bottom, and he could therefore, I think, be a big help, and already has ideas for very interesting recovery programs.
What is his conclusion in terms of recovery? What does he think is something that works that maybe people are not doing?
Well, I think what he's talked about setting up these centers all over the country in rural areas, a lot of them, where kids would work together, learning about sustainable agriculture, the importance of that. He would bring them together in these situations where there was a real, and they would, also get together and have kind of, what do you call them, encounter groups, or um, similar to what AA does, but for young people. And there was a film that just came out called Recovering America. It's a documentary where he talks about this very clearly, and I would highly recommend that folks see it.
Well, that's definitely my audience would be very interested in if they haven't seen it already. One of the things that I was fascinated with was that even when he was struggling, he still always seemed to be pursuing something meaningful.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could speak to that and what you learned about his past that maybe made it possible for him to have those values, to always be trying to do good and always trying to learn and always trying to find what his purpose was going to be, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, of course, it was ingrained in him when he was young. I mean, just as Robert Kennedy, his father, just as his father before him, had these every night. They'd have these dinner table conversations and debates, and he had 10 brothers and sisters. So they would sit there and they would take up the issues of the day, or if his father had just come back from Mississippi and encountering the terrible poverty there, and starving kids with extended bellies. I mean, he would talk about this, and he would tell these kids, someday I want you to take up these problems because they're so terrible. And so he grew up with that sense of purpose. And at the same time, though, he was given like his freedom, to pursue what he wanted to do. His father didn't try to make him into a politician. I mean, he wanted to be a veterinarian, as I said. and that was great. Those interests were encouraged, but he was always out in nature. He loved nature, and so that once he um, was a recovering addict coming out of rehab. He'd already gotten his law degree. I mean, he'd been a very high functioning addict, so to speak, and he'd gotten his law degree, and he was still looking to pass the bar. And there was this group called Riverkeeper, which his father had taken him out on the Hudson River when he was a kid, and it was the most polluted river in the country, or one of them. And his father was outraged about it because he couldn't even eat the fish from the river anymore. And then Bobby's first job, when he was coming out of rehab, was as a riverkeeper on the Hudson. And boy, did they accomplish some amazing stuff. Finding polluters and eventually cleaning up the Hudson River. So um, I don't know. Does that give you a bit of a sense of what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people have heard about that, but I had no idea to the extent that you go into it in the book that just for years and years and years he worked with his knowledge of the law to go after different corporations and governments wherever there was wrongdoing. Can you give our listeners a little sense of the way he fought for justice and things that he thought were important by using these methods?
Yeah, I mean, he was passionate about, first of all, cleaning up that river, and then it expanded into what's today called the Waterkeeper Alliance, where there's 300 different grassroots groups all over the planet that are working to keep their rivers, habitable. And he took on ExxonMobil, he took on Monsanto, he took on these huge corporations, and eventually wrote a book called Crimes Against Nature, where which he at that point he was giving speeches all over the country. Huge crowds were attending his speeches in the early 2000s when he was seeing so clearly that corporate capture was what was behind a lot of the problems that we had, whereas the people who were in the EPA and later the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, or the National Institute of Health, there was a revolving door between the agency that was supposed to protect people and the industry that was polluting people and the natural environment. So he learned a lot about that, and this is one of the themes that he's taken up now, continued to emphasize, is that that's what he would end once he became president, if he could do it.
He was very popular for a while when he was fighting these different companies. But then when COVID came around and he started challenging the pharmaceutical companies, as he had been doing for a long time, things got a little bit different in terms of the attacks. Can you explain what a big moment COVID was? Obviously for everyone, but also in terms of the kind of work that he has done.
Yeah, well, it was huge. Of course, by that point, he'd already been, when he was 10 years earlier, he was lionized, as he was a hero of the planet in Time magazine. He was, writing op-eds all the time about various issues. But once he took up the public health issue and the vaccine issue, back in the early 2000s, he was marginalized, and they wouldn't even let him write a letter to the editor and publish it anymore. So the media really turned against him. And I chronicle in the book how the New York Times, they had a big meeting with him, and just totally ended up blackballing him. But once COVID came along, yeah, that was huge because the emphasis was on Moderna and Pfizer developing these new kinds of vaccines which had never been really adequately tested. Um, and he was already well aware that Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was extolled as America's savior in all of this, uh, had a pretty dark side that he had been looking at for many years. That was going to push all this through for the big pharmaceutical industry, and the media would of course back it up all the way, and the politicians, and he was going to fight it. And he began doing so almost immediately in 2020 because some of the key elements that were out there that could have been used by people to protect people or people who were ill, in particular ivermectin, was listed by most people as a terrible thing to take, and in fact it was very effective against COVID. But once he started espousing therapeutic remedies that were not the vaccine rush to judgment, whatever the word is,
Right.
rushing it all into people's arms, then he was persona non grata in a lot of places.
One of the things that you raise in the book is that, and probably people have a sense of this, but maybe not to the extent. I forget the exact stat, but it said something along the lines that maybe like upwards of 70% of advertising on the mainstream media, or maybe it's the news sources, comes from pharmaceutical companies. And
Yeah.
and that's where they're getting their money. And I don't know if it's that simple, if that's the reason, but the media will just not take any criticism of those companies because it's their lifeblood. Is that it,
Yeah, and
more or less,
yeah,
or
I think so. I mean, it used to be until the mid 1980s, I think 1986, when Reagan was president. It used to be that pharmaceutical advertising was banned on TV, and all of a sudden, they lifted that restriction, and eventually, like you say, I think it's 70% of the news, the nightly news, for example, was backed up by advertising from big pharma. So they had a stake in this, and then the media increasingly, General Electric ended up owning, I think it was NBC, uh, and so big corporations started moving in, consolidating in these media companies, and Kennedy was very very opposed to that.
he often will say that there's no bigger fan of capitalism than him, but that it needs to be checked or something along those lines. Can you explain a little bit what his view is of capitalism, and what kinds of restrictions need to be placed on it?
Yeah, well, he has said that he is a free market capitalist, but he does not see that we have a free market anymore. And what he would do if he became president would be to eliminate the subsidies for fossil fuels, which are continuing to prop up the oil and gas industries to an alarming extent at the expense of alternative energy, which is more and more coming to the fore, but not can't really compete yet with the big oil companies. So yeah, he says corporate capture, as I mentioned, um, is destroying our country, and he's proposed a 5-year ban on former officials from government agencies lobbying when they've gone to work for these big companies. So that's the kind of restrictions that he's been talking about, and but he wants to see the market work, and he doesn't feel that it is.
Yeah.
So it's about as simple as that.
One of the things that people found surprising that follow his career is that in recent years he's actually come out and spoken publicly, and it's in the book too, that he has some real questions about the assassinations of JFK and his dad. And he really is a remarkable person. I mean, you present him as somebody who's just always seeking the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And I was wondering, I mean, you're an expert on this topic. You've had books on this topic separate from this one, but tell me what you've learned about Robert Kennedy Jr.'s views on these assassinations.
Yeah, well, for years, like most of his family, all of his family, really, they just didn't want to go there and didn't want to consider that there might have been something other than a lone nut killing his father and his uncle. But I think it was like 2008. He read a book by Jim Douglas called JFK and the Unspeakable, which kind of turned his head around. And then he went to Ted Sorensen. Sorensen had been a speechwriter for his father, and they talked about it. And Sorensen had his doubts, so he began to really consider, and finally came out on Charlie Rose, I think, about 10 years ago, 2013, somewhere in there, and said he believed there'd been a conspiracy to assassinate his father and his uncle, and that he believed that there had been involvement by the CIA. So he and I mean, for years, our relationship was based around the environment and work. We both were very concerned about doing with the environment. And then, so I never even raised the fact that I had written this huge book about his uncle's assassination long before I met him. And finally, though, he wanted to know what I knew, and we talked about it. And he's definitely come around to believe, in his father's assassination, for example, that Sirhan, who he interestingly, and I write about this in the book, went to see in prison, much to the chagrin, of his siblings. They thought that was, so Sirhan was up for parole,
Mm.
and Bobby went to hang out with him and spent 3 hours with him, and came away believing Sirhan was very sincere in the fact that, number one, he couldn't remember ever going into the pantry, and number two, he'd seen evidence already that none of those bullets from Sirhan's gun, they hit other people, but they did not hit his father. And in fact, he only had 8 shots in his gun, and there were 13 bullets found in the wall. So his father was killed from behind. Somebody shooting, into his head, his neck, and it was likely a security guard, so called, that had been hired at the last minute, in 1968, and was there in the pantry. And so he came out in support of Sirhan's release from prison, and that didn't happen. I mean, the parole board supported it even, but then Governor Newsom got a lot of flack from other family members, and so it didn't happen. But I mean, he's still fighting for the truth about what really happened to his uncle and his father.
That's really remarkable. And there's been several different times where, because of stances he's taken, like on this issue, and even his decision to run for president, where he'll have to kind of go against the wishes of his family.
Yep.
And it does seem like family's very important to him, and yet he'll still make these decisions. What does that tell you about him as a person?
Well, I think it's quite an admirable trait. I mean, he's not afraid to go against what his siblings. Some of them work in the public health field, and they've been really upset that with his work in public health, and that he's kind of moved in and tried to say, hey, we got to look at things a little differently. And certainly they were upset about his wanting to reopen the assassination investigations. So there's a lot of, his father spoke about moral courage, and I see a lot of that in Bobby Kennedy. That he's somebody who's not just courageous physically. I mean, yeah, he went on these whitewater rivers and risked his life in certain cases, but he's also, he has a sense of what's right and wrong, and that if he feels strongly about something, he's not going to not talk about it just because he's opposed by no matter who's opposing him. And I think that's rare, and something we want in a national leader.
Well, if there was ever a time for him to run, and I'm not endorsing him, I'm just saying when you look at how divided the country is right now and how upset on both sides people are with the Democratic and Republican candidates,
Yep.
you would think this was his time. Is there some path forward for him? I mean, in your opinion, I imagine you're watching this very carefully. Um, do you think there is a chance that this is like slowly starting to evolve and maybe it's going to happen? Or do you think that just with the stances that he's taken, there's just probably not a realistic chance?
I think there is a chance. I mean, I don't say that just because I'm his friend and his biographer, but after the Trump Biden debate, his polling numbers went up from quite a bit already. From 15% to 19% favorability, and another poll showed that more than 50% of the American people are so discouraged about the choices they have with the two-party system that they want an independent to win. And so if he could get into the debates, which, they denied him this past time because they claimed that he didn't have enough signatures. And in fact, he did. He had enough signatures in states already with 310 electoral votes, which is quite a bit more than I think you need 270 to win the election. He's really fighting to get on the ballot in all 50 states, and I think he's probably going to do it. And they may not be able to keep him off that debate stage next time uh, on technicalities as they did this time. You know, I understood that I think it was a Trump official promised CNN producer, a CNN producer, that they, don't worry, we can't get Kennedy into this debate. Well, he would take him apart actually because he knows his stuff and he's speaking out on issues that mean a lot to the American people. And I think they deserve a chance to see him. And if they do, then I think we could see some pretty interesting developments as the election nears.
And if he is able to get into that debate, for people that have not, I mean, I've seen him all over the place because I watch a lot of alternative news and listen to a lot of podcasts. But they keep him pretty much off of the mainstream media, pretty much. He's on there occasionally, like on Fox or something. But um, what will people expect to hear from him? Um, and we can wrap up with this.
Yeah, well, I think he's going to talk about a number of things that other candidates are not. I mean, immigration, for example. It's interesting. You know, he's not ideological. So I had dinner at his house after he came back from a trip to Yuma, Arizona, and he was talking to border officials down there, and he was shocked at the fact that so much of what's going on at the border is fueled by the Mexican drug cartels, who are, running drugs into this country through tunnels, who are bringing people from all kinds of countries that aren't Latin America in to do this. And so he's in favor of sealing the southern border, as he calls it, but expanding the opportunity for illegal immigration. He calls it high walls, wide gates. So I think that's one thing he would certainly be talking about. He would talk about censorship and the First Amendment, which the Biden administration has been shutting him off and doing everything they can, colluding with the social media companies. He would raise the minimum wage. He would talk about free childcare. He'd refocus the National Institute of Health to really look at how to take care of how to prevent chronic diseases, which affect now more than 50% of our population. And he says he'd cut the military budget in half and seek a diplomatic solution in Ukraine. So if all these things happened, and of course we don't know if they could in our system, but also the housing crisis he's talked about. The middle class cannot afford, the young people cannot afford to buy a home. And what's going on is big companies like BlackRock are targeting these single family homes and snapping them up, and who can compete with that? So he would change the tax code to make it more difficult for those big corporations to control things like this. All those things he would talk about, and I think people would resonate with.
Well, Dick, I've been following your work for years, and I'd love to have you on the program again to talk about some of your other books. But right now, I'd like to recommend to our listeners um, the book, The Real RFK Jr., The Trials of a Truth Warrior. It's very timely, and it's just a very interesting story of the man's life, and I think everyone's going to find him fascinating, even if you're not voting for him. It's just a great, great book. Thank you so much for joining me on the program, and I wish you the best with the book.
Hey, Tom, thanks so much. I really enjoyed talking with you today.
All right, thank you for all that. Talk to you later.